It's Speak It Thursday. And you already know what time it is. I'm your girl, Shuli. We are back with another episode. And tonight, we're celebrating men. I feel like Father's Day is coming up, and men always talk about they get the short end of the stick. Women get all the attention for Mother's Day, they get all the wonderful gifts. Men get socks and ties and the same old gift over and over again. And I feel like we've been through a lot with the pandemic and everything that has been exposed to us in the last year. And I wanted to take June, the full month, to celebrate men and specifically our Black men. Black men are out there doing great things. The media says so much. There's so much conflict, but we want to celebrate the good in us, the kings, the men that are using their voices, the men that are moving the culture forward, the men that want to see us all be great, the men that we can just applaud and say, keep doing what you're doing, Black man. And the guest that I have tonight, I feel like he demonstrates that. He is all about that. And even just having this conversation in on the back end of things, let me know I already knew I had the right choice, but he solidified that he's doing so much more than I've read and that I know. So, anyway, I won't do all the talking. I'll let him talk for himself. He does a great job at that. Without further ado, we're going to bring up our guest tonight, Coach Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor is a 9-time author, coach, entrepreneur and publisher, and just all around Black man doing great things. Good evening. Welcome.
Well, good evening, Shirley. Thank you so much for this opportunity to definitely share some reasons for optimism, especially for Black men, because there's so much negativity out there for us. One of the things that I simply made a commitment to doing was to simply provide a resource that supports and empowers Black men. And that's what I'm really all about.
Tell me about the resource.
Well, the resource is called the Shatter the Stereotypes movement. And it is an offshoot of a book that I wrote called Shattering Black Male Stereotypes, eradicating the 10 most destructive media-generated illusions about Black men. And in the book, I talk about these 10 illusions that the media has perpetuated for a very, very long time. And unfortunately, a lot of us as Black men buy into some of these stereotypes. And that is the reason some of us aren't as successful as we could be. So providing this resource simply, I like using the term wake up. It allows us to wake up to who we really are. And there are not a lot of Black men in what I'll call the personal development space. And so as a writer and an author and a speaker, I simply took the time to say, look, we need specific resources for Black men. And I've actually been writing about Black male issues since 1994.
Come on. So, Black male issues, writing about it since 1994. So that means you are not new to this. You're true to this, even in this space. And before we even go further, let's talk about those stereotypes. You said there are 10 that are perpetuated by the media. And we have these discussions, I feel like, as a community. But just in case we're not clear, what are those stereotypes that are most perpetuated?
Well, Shuli, let me back up just a little bit and set the context of how I got into this, because I think it's really important. So back in the early 80s, late 80s, early 90s, I was living the American dream. I had the house, the wife, the 2.5 kids and all of that. By society standards, I had succeeded. And within about a 6.5 year time frame, my American dream turned into the American nightmare. And I went through a divorce, bankruptcy, a foreclosure, a deep, deep depression. And I was actually homeless for 2 years living out of my car. And during the darkest period of my life, I received a miracle. I was sitting up late one night because I was too depressed to sleep. And I was sitting at the edge of my bed looking across the room at my bookshelf when I happened to notice that every book on my bookshelf has something to do with getting rich or making money. And as I looked at those books, this question just popped in my head. Michael, what if you took the same energy and effort you've used in trying to get rich and simply figure out how to be happy? And then after asking that question, something in me shifted. All of a sudden, my depression lifted, and I had this amazing clarity that I was going to be able to rebuild my life and it was going to become extraordinary. I had no idea how I was going to do it. It was just a feeling that I had that I was going to be able to do that. And the second question that came up for me during this time was, what does it mean to be a man? Because I had done everything that I thought a man was supposed to do to be happy, and I was absolutely miserable.
What was that? What were the things that you think as a man at that time that you thought it took to be happy?
Having the house, the wife, the 2.5 kids, the vacations, and the 401ks.
What you just said. So when it came
So,
crashing down,
yeah.
you found yourself.
Yeah, when I lost all of that, I went, well, what's the point? Because I did it all. Society says I was supposed to do it. And look how my life had turned out. So it was in making a choice, because that's what this is really about. I made a choice. I made a choice that I was going to transform my life. And as a result of that question, I stopped reading books on getting rich and making money. And I started reading books on psychology and philosophy, spirituality, metaphysics, personal development. So I went on this amazing journey of transformation. And as I started putting my life back together, I realized that I had some things to share with other men, because I knew I couldn't have been the only guy that had gone through some of the things I went through. So I wanted to take the lessons that I learned and share with other men. And back in 1995, I wrote a book called Brothers, Are You Listening? A Success Guide for the New Millennium. And it was my journey of change or transforming my life and putting my life back together. And so again, that's how I started this whole writing journey back in 1995. So before I jump into those stereotypes, I want to give you an opportunity if there's any other questions that popped up, because once I get rolling, I'll start rolling.
I know, I love it. So when I'm talking to a speaker, it's kind of like you already know what to say and you have your story down pat, and I am here for it. And one of the things that stood out to me, like you said, you were married, you had all those things and you lost it all, but you said homeless for 2 years. Because looking at you now and just even how I became acquainted with you as a good neighbor and president of the homeowners association and all of those things back in the day when I lived in Stafford, you would never know what a person has gone through. And I know overcoming adversity is how you coach men to overcome their adversity. But what was that like? And then, because I feel like there's somebody out there now who's like, yeah, that sounds good. That's cool, but you don't know my situation. So what would you say to a guy who's stuck? Because 2 years, that's not like a really short stint of time when you're thinking about it.
Well, but I believe every human being has a divine purpose. This is just my belief. And I also believe that if we're willing to look deeply enough, every adversity actually brings us a gift and a lesson. And I know how difficult that can be when you're right smack dab in the middle of a major challenge or adversity. But think about this. I was born in an inner city projects of Corpus Christi, Texas, to a single mom with 6 kids. And we were basically the poster children for poverty back in the 60s. I dropped out of high school in the 11th grade because I convinced myself that I could get rich selling vacuum cleaners. And so it didn't work out. But fortunately, I landed a job with this building supply center. I climbed the corporate ladder. And as mentioned, I became very successful. I had it all. I lost it all. But now my life is actually what I had been dreaming about all of my life, which is to be pretty joyful and happy and passionate about my life. And so I've built my version of an extraordinary life. And everyone has to define extraordinary for themselves. But who's ever watching this video right now, I can assure you, they have within them the ability, the capacity to overcome any challenge, any obstacle that may be in their way. Now, as a man who happens to be Black, obviously we have all those external things that we sometimes get blinded by. Things like racism and discrimination and all of that. And in no way do I deny that those things exist. But if I can accomplish what I've accomplished with my limited amount of education, my limited amount of resources early on, I'm living proof of what's possible when somebody puts their mind to something. And so what I coach people on doing is recognizing that you have the capacity to be, to do, and to have anything you set your mind to. And the amazing thing about this, Julie, is I learned that lesson when I was about 10 years old. Because my mom, even though we were poor, government assistance, food stamps, the whole 9 yards, my mom said something that stuck with me to this day. She said this. She said, Michael, if you want something badly enough, there's no one or no thing that can keep you from accomplishing it except yourself. Now, think about it. This is in the 60s. But yet she instilled in me at a very early age that I was responsible for my success. I never once heard my mom complain about racism and all of that. My mom said, if you want it, go get it.
She was your life coach.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
She was your life coach.
Everything I am is the result of her and the lessons that she taught me. So again, it's been an amazing journey. And at the same time, I know the guys who may be watching this and may say, well, you don't understand my situation. Well, I do understand your situation because I've been there and I know what's possible if you set your mind to something.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. And I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge the people who checked in. I asked people to drop their city. I like to know where they're from. And we have Houston, Texas in the house, Dallas. Yep. And we have good old Humble, Texas. And we have two guys in the audience. We have some people, some eyes on us, and we don't know where they're from. But I would like to welcome you all to Speak It. And we're here with Coach Michael Taylor. And he's getting ready to drop these 10 stereotypes. And then we're getting, and another Dallas. We have another Dallas person in the audience. Welcome. Dallas is in the house. But yeah, so stereotypes. Talk about it. Let's break it down and let's get into this masculinity conversation.
So here's how I came to this idea about these 10 stereotypes. Back in the 90s when I wrote my first book, I was actually, before I wrote the book, I was in a restaurant and I overheard a conversation between these two well-dressed, well-spoken, professional black men. And they were having a conversation about the eradication of black men from society. And it was one of the most depressing conversations I'd ever heard. So I walked over to their table and I apologized for eavesdropping, but I asked the guy, I said, man, please tell me you don't believe what you just said. And this guy looked at me and he said, absolutely. And then he said this, don't you watch the news? He said, I believe in 20 years, all black men will either be dead or in jail. And it wasn't what he said so much that really broke my heart, but how he said it. I could feel the powerlessness in his voice. And I knew that he had such a defeatist attitude that there was nothing I could have said that would have changed his mind. So I put my hand on his shoulder and I simply said, don't believe the hype. And I walked away. And as I walked away, there was something in me that said, you have to do something. I had no idea what to do because my life was actually a mess at the time. But there was something in me that said I had to do something to change the mindset of black men. And that's when I became a writer, which leads us to illusion or stereotype number one, that black men are an endangered species.
I've heard that.
Absolutely. So the reason that those two young men were having that conversation is because they had accepted the media-generated stereotype that we're an endangered species. So it's important that as black men, we challenge ourselves to ask ourselves, do we really believe these stereotypes? Because I've done seminars and workshops where black men have come up to me afterwards and they would say, man, I got to tell you, I used to be one of those guys. I blame the man. You know, I blame society. I blamed everybody but myself. And one of the things that I coach people on is taking 100% responsibility for your life turning out the way you want it to. So that's the very first illusion. The stereotype is that black men are an endangered species. And again, if you pay attention to mainstream media, what do you see? Black men being shot by police officers, black men being accused of deadbeat dads, which is one of the stereotypes we'll talk about. We see how many, they bring up the story of how many black men are incarcerated. So I can understand how a lot of black men have accepted this illusion that we're threatened. There is absolutely no threat to black men. Are there challenges? Of course there are. But black men are doing better now than we ever have. And I don't have to bring up a bunch of statistics to prove that. I'm proof of it myself, of,
Mm-hmm.
of what's possible. So that's illusion number one,
Okay.
that black men aren't endangered species, because that's definitely not true. So I'll take a breather and I'll let you talk.
I know. Well, right. We're here, the Coach Michael Show. So Ivan Parker agrees. He gave the praise hands in the audience, and I'm just wondering if there's a man that was listening, one of the men that's tuned in, if they felt like they were endangered or if they agree with you. So I want to hear that, and then, well, you gave us the illusion, and like you said, the truth is black men are doing better, and so I know a lot of this is, like we talked about, is perpetuated by the media, but what do you say about cases like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery and the things that happened last year? Oh, Calvin Williams said that he also agrees. So is that just a speck under the microscope and we're focusing on that? And is it, so it's a two-part, and is it causing us to take our attention off of the real truth?
Well, we have to understand how our media operates. The media's job is to sensationalize and over dramatize and focus on everything that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to black folk, their whole job has been, since the beginning of time, is to showcase the negative aspects of us. So we've been perpetuated, as you know, you hear people talk, the media talking about, when you talk about poverty, the first person that comes to mind is a black person, because the media shows black people in poverty, when in fact there's always been more poor black or white people than black people.
Now that's the truth. Exactly.
And
Yeah.
that's a fact. So,
That is, the stats support that.
so the point here is that in no way do I ever deny the challenges that are out there, especially when we see the stories of police brutality and so forth. So I don't want to deny that, but once again, my job as a coach is to support people in recognizing that you have to be willing to disconnect from mainstream media. You have to let go of all of those stories. And that doesn't mean you're going to deny that it's happening. There's a woman named Byron Katie, and she said something that I thought was absolutely profound. And she said this: when it comes to reality, there's three types of business. There's my business, there's your business, and there's God's business.
Mm.
And she says, the reason so many people are unhappy is because they're always in somebody else's business.
Oh, yes.
So if
Go
you
ahead.
think about this, when we see those stories on television, as painful and as difficult as they may be to watch, in reality, that's still somebody else's business. It's not happening to us, right? So if we're able to make sure we distinguish between somebody else's business, what's happening to someone else, and focus on our business, which is, how am I reacting to what I'm seeing? Then we start gaining our personal power. See, because I remember when Philando Castile got killed, and I'll never forget, I was heartbroken for 3 days. Now, again, I'm an optimistic guy. I know about mindset and changing attitudes, but my heart was literally broken from seeing that. Even today, if I see that video, I'll start crying. It just broke my heart. So obviously that didn't happen to me, but it impacted me. As black men, how many of us have resources in which we can process what we're seeing? Because what happens is, when we see events like this, a lot of times what happens is, sometimes black men act out in rage, rightfully so in some cases, anger, frustration. But as black men, how many times do we go to a place where we can talk about our sadness? We can talk about our fear. See, that's the challenge for us as black men. We need resources to help us deal with the things that we see that are going on out there, but that are impacting us in here, in our hearts and in our minds. And so, again, I don't want to minimize when those things are happening, but true transformation comes from recognizing that I may not be able to control what's going on outside of me, but I have complete control of what's going on inside of me. And I get to choose how I respond to anything that happens outside of me. And so if I make it a point to stay in my business, which means how I feel, what I think, what I believe, then I can transform myself and how I'm responding to those external circumstances.
Okay. I was trying to type that down there, and that was feedback, like you said, is excellent. We have Black men in the audience that they agree with you. So that's it. So you're taking the stance of empowerment. A Facebook user said, definitely need a support system in peer development. Yes, for sure. So like you said, we Black men need safe spaces to go to talk about these things and to work through these issues and to focus in on the truth. All right, stereotype number 2. Tell us that, because we want to work through this. We have an hour, so we're gonna work through these as quickly as we can. But also, we want the nuggets. So
yeah, so let's go to number 2. And number 2, the stereotype is Black men try to be white.
mm,
Now think about that one for a moment. For most of my life, I have been accused of being a sellout because of some of the choices that I made. For example, I was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, right on the coast. I love to surf. I had a surfboard in my bedroom. You didn't see Black people surfing. My friends
no.
my friends would come over and they'd always laugh because I had this big surfboard in my bedroom, and they couldn't understand, wait a minute, what are you doing surfing? Black people don't surf. Well, the truth is, too many times we compartmentalize as Black people that we're supposed to do things that only Black people do, which makes no sense to me. Because as a human being, I believe you have the capacity to do whatever you want to do. So it's 2021. It's not 1960 anymore.
Yeah.
The limitations are no longer there. Doesn't mean that there aren't obstacles, but the limitations are no longer there. So as Black men, we have to be willing to challenge ourselves to see if we're afraid of doing something because we don't want to be accused of trying to be white. So I hear often, you talk white. you know, I hear often that Black men don't talk about feelings. So these are things that as Black men, we get pigeonholed into believing we aren't supposed to do. So what do? We don't want to deny our ethnicity. We don't want to be sellouts. So we sometimes refuse to do something that our hearts may be telling us to do. So we have to be willing to not buy into that illusion that Black men trying to be white because we choose to do things that quote unquote may not be Black.
Whew, you hit on a lot of things, and I think that's a deeper conversation that our community needs to have. Like, what is Blackness and the monolith? We are not a monolith. Okay, so Facebook user said, "Preach, Corpus Christi," and someone said, "My in-laws are in Gregory, Portland. I live in Kingsville. I lived in Kingsville for 5 years. Definitely heard that plenty of times. No such thing as acting white." Right.
See, and again, you think about it. See, we live in a culture that has promoted this whole white supremacy thing since we were brought over here. And too many times we're still buying into that, what they put upon us.
Mm-hmm.
You're Black, you're only supposed to do this. Well, what do you think the civil rights movement was about? It was about us gaining access to do what we want to do.
And we're excellent. That's our history.
Absolutely. But see, the key is we now have access. See, because obviously there was a time in this country we did not have access. Remember, there was a time when we weren't even allowed to read. Think about that for a moment.
True.
We weren't even allowed to read. So how could we compete intellectually when we were not given the opportunity to be intellectuals? Well, guess what? It's 2021. You have no excuse not to read, not to learn what you want to learn about.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah. Civil rights equals crushing limitations. I like that. Number 3, jump into that. Stereotype number 3.
Number 3 is, I'm going to skip around a little bit because they're not really in chronological order.
That's fine.
So I'm going to skip around. And here's one that I want to touch up on is that Black men can't be monogamous.
Ooh. Come
Uh-oh.
on. So that also sounds like black men are dogs. That was going to be one of my questions. Black men are dogs. Black men cheat. Can talk
That's
about it.
that's all in that same conversation. Now, if you think about culture and you think about the history of, let's say, rap music as an example, and I am in no way dogging out rap music. Absolutely love rap music, but obviously there are some aspects of it that I think we need to change, which is perpetuating this idea that all men are players, all men want to just sleep around, don't want to connect emotionally and spiritually with their mates. So the illusion, the stereotype is that we as black men can't be faithful. But the reality is, we're just as capable of monogamy as any other group. But my question to black men is to ask them honestly, are you willing to be emotionally available, emotionally vulnerable, emotionally connected to your partner? And my specialty is masculinity and how the changing roles of masculinity are actually changing for the better. And from a black male perspective, it's important that we as black men start having this conversation, because a lot of us think when we hear the word intimacy, we think of sex.
Mm-hmm.
Say, oh, I'm intimate, you know? But intimacy and sex aren't the same thing. Intimacy is the ability to into me see my deepest heart, how I feel, what I
Mm-hmm.
believe. And when I can open my heart and connect intimately to my partner, then I create connection. And with that being said, I'm going to give you a formula.
Okay.
You want a formula for creating great relationships?
Come on, let's do it.
Here you go. A plus A plus A equals C. You ready?
Okay, break that down.
You ready?
Mm-hmm.
First A is attention.
Mm.
How much attention do we give our partners? Okay. A number two is affection. Affection does not necessarily have to mean touching. It means showing and expressing how you feel.
Okay.
And last A is appreciation. If you take attention, affection, and appreciation and you incorporate those into your relationships, then you create C, which is connection.
Mm.
And that is what we long for. We long for connection. Unfortunately, a lot of us, most of us actually, don't have the emotional tools to create that connection. And
Okay.
that's part of my work, challenging men to create the space so that they can connect intimately with themselves, so they can connect intimately with others.
So men want connection. I'm hearing you say this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Men will deny it. Men will stick their chests out and brag about, yeah, I got this, that, and the other. But as human beings, we're wired for connection.
Mm.
Why do you think we even attempt to engage in relationships? Because we're social creatures. It's part of our human makeup. But if we have too much emotional baggage
Mm-hmm.
that we're unwilling to unpack, we can't use this formula, because the formula begins with self-love.
Oh,
You can't
Lord.
you can't love someone else if you don't love yourself.
I agree. And so we have women that go to conferences, workshops, trainings, read books, and things like that. What do you suggest for men? What do you do? How do you start to change this so that they can build this? Do I have that right? I have attention, affection plus appreciation equals connection. Is that right? That's that relationship formula.
That's it. That's
And
it.
so how do we get get there? I'm saying we, but I feel like it's a work that men have to do, and I think it's a man to man thing. That's my opinion. Because I feel like women, we can jump up and down and say what we want to say, but I feel like until that man gets to that point, I don't know if it's futile. Like, I think the best thing we can do in those situations is pray and continue to love and nurture if you feel like it's healthy and it's worth it. But
Well,
from a man, I want to hear what you have to say.
well, you have to understand our culture. Women have always been conditioned to be nurturers. As men, we have been conditioned to believe that we have three responsibilities,
Mm.
what I call the three P's: procreate, provide, and protect. So as men, we're wired to believe that those are our three responsibilities. So we're taught these things: provide, procreate, and protect.
Yeah.
But no one said that we needed to learn how to connect. The reason it's so difficult for us as men to connect because we live in a culture that has conditioned men to believe that emotions are for women. We hear that I don't want to talk about my feelings, right? It's the big
Yeah.
F word. Men are terrified sometimes of talking about emotions and feeling. But you can't connect without emotion. You cannot be relational if you're unwilling to be emotional. And the reason so many of us as men struggle with relationships is because we have that piece missing, that
Mm.
emotional piece missing. So what do? We rationalize and intellectualize relationships, and we don't know how to go to our hearts. And that's where the connection comes from. Now, I mentioned earlier that I went through a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to be willing to learn all of this stuff that I'm talking about. So I'm just not reading it from a clinical perspective. I'm talking from experience. And here's a very powerful lesson that I learned. When I was married the first time, I remember when we bought our first house. Okay. I had my chest stuck out. Man, I was the man. I brought my wife, my wife at the time. We walked into the house and I was just like proud. I was looking around. Beautiful home. And my former wife looked at me and she says, this is a nice house. And she says, but I would have been just as happy in the apartment with you. Now, when she said that, she meant it with every fiber of her being. But here's what I heard in my little head. This woman don't appreciate how hard I'm working. She don't appreciate this. And I got mad at her for saying what she said. But the truth was, I had a lot of emotional conflict that I didn't even recognize. So what I was doing, I'm accomplishing all these things, trying to make her happy because my job was to provide, right? That's what we're taught. So
Provide, protect,
and
procreate.
procreate. So I'm providing for her and she's not appreciating what I'm providing for her. So I'm pissed off, right? Well, see, that was my stuff. That was my issue. I had to be willing to look at that and unpack some of the reasons why that was. And so from a male perspective, we have to be willing to do what I call go on our inner journey. And that inner journey is about challenging the beliefs and assumptions that we have about ourselves. We have to be willing to talk about trauma and how it impacts us. We have to talk about these things because until we heal and move through, excuse me, some of the traumatic stuff that we may have gone through, we can never be whole. Now, I possibly had the worst childhood a child could have. From the ages of 6 to 13, every imaginable type of abuse I experienced. Now, as a result of that trauma, I created these defense mechanisms. And this is how the mind works. When we experience pain and trauma, the mind's job is to help you alleviate and minimize that pain. You don't want to feel that. So you start thinking and rationalizing to not feel. Okay? So what I did as a result of that trauma, my defense mechanism was being smart and being a people pleaser. See, I was a people pleaser. I was the Mr. Nice Guy. I was always trying to get other people's approval. And as I was climbing the corporate ladder, it was like, look at me, see what I'm accomplishing. But the truth is, I was so filled with what this guy named John Bradshaw calls toxic shame. That toxic shame was driving my behavior. And it wasn't until I healed that toxic shame that I was able to become free. And so that process of dealing with trauma, that's how we connect to our emotions. because there comes a time in our lives when something happens, and especially when we're kids, that we make a decision. And that decision is that something's wrong with us. And we stop feeling worthy. And we think that we have to do things to be worthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, from an emotional standpoint, as men, we don't talk about that type of stuff. Like, nah, we just suppress, repress, and deny it. But the truth is, until we become willing to heal and deal with that trauma, it will impact our lives in so many what we call sideways. It shows up in sideways, failed relationships,
Mm-hmm.
addictions, all of that stuff because
I'm
we
ready to
don't
count them
have
off. Yes.
we don't have the emotional tools. And in our community, we've been taught that if we have issues, what do? We go to Jesus, and we pray about it. But that doesn't necessarily heal the pain. So we have to be willing to stop spiritual bypassing our traumas, be willing to heal our traumas, which allows us to connect to our divinity. And that's a whole different conversation.
Ooh,
So,
that is. I'm writing notes and I'm talking here. I want to go back and acknowledge some audience comments because you've been dropping jewels, like jewel after jewel after jewel. And I appreciate your transparency. Oh my gosh. Marie Cruz says, wow, preach. Men are humans too, and human emotions are real. So many men get shut down because of real emotions.
oh, yeah. I mean, because I remember after my divorce, I had a really difficult time creating relationships. As a matter of fact, what really saved me was a really good friend of mine because I was struggling with relationships, which was really, I was struggling with intimacy because of the pain of my divorce. And so I was trying to figure out how to get back into this relationship game. And so I was having a pity party with this friend of mine. And I was telling her, I said, you women say you want a good man and I'm a good man. And why y'all keep leaving? Because there was this pattern that I found. And the pattern was my relationships would last about 2 to 3 weeks tops. And then the women would all say the same thing. I care too much about you to stay in this relationship. I won't stay in this relationship because you're emotionally unavailable. Now, at the time, it made absolutely no sense to me what they meant. Because again, I was a good guy, believed in monogamy, being faithful, fun loving guy, easy to hang out with. But I didn't have the emotional tools to connect. And the women recognized that and they were leaving. So, anyway, I'm having this pity party with my friend. And she said something that changed my life. She said, Michael, if one person calls you a jackass, you probably shouldn't worry about it. But if two or more do, you might want to get a saddle. Have you not noticed that you're the only common denominator in all of your relationships? And when she said that, something clicked. I didn't get defensive. I listened. And for the first time, I heard what she said. And a lot of people had said it before. I had to be willing to look at what it was about Michael Taylor that was keeping him from creating the relationship that he knew he wanted more than anything. And what was keeping me from doing that was my emotional unavailability. And so I went through that healing process to heal through that trauma that I talked about so that I could learn how to connect. Now,
Amen.
blissfully
Amen.
connected for the past 19 years.
Yes. Calvin Williams says, I don't have a problem with connecting if she's indeed a safe space and has truly kept my trust.
Well, Calvin, I got to speak to that because that is so, so powerful. Because what happens is women say they want good men. But when you start talking about things like emotional vulnerability and openness and things like that, a lot of women aren't prepared for that. I know that I had several women that I dated
Mm-hmm.
that were very professional, smart, degreed women. But once again, some of them accused me of trying to be white because I was talking about how I felt. And so
You were too emo for the ladies at one point. So there was that. Okay.
and so here I am trying to share openly and honestly, and the women wouldn't emotionally prepare for that. So as much as women say they want men to be like that, it takes an incredibly strong woman who's connected to herself to be able to hear and to create the space that allows us to share from that place. And it ain't easy. Trust me, it ain't easy. So thank you, Calvin, for that.
Calvin said, "Say it, brother." So you have a supporter, and I'm glad that the men are tuned in, because this is not, this is not about bashing men or telling men what to do to get right from another man, but it's about the celebration of manhood and overcoming these stereotypes, as you say, shattering the stereotypes. And I feel like, since we're here talking about the Black men can't be monogamous stereotype, and we're talking about emotion and connection, I feel like it's only right to address toxic masculinity. What does that mean to you? And in this conversation, how is it important?
So there's a big buzzword going around called toxic masculinity. I don't know how many people may have seen the commercial that the Gillette company put out. The company that makes razors, they did a commercial, and it got a lot of backlash from men because men were saying that the commercial was perpetuating this idea that men were toxic. But in reality, what the commercial was saying was that men should be willing and open to looking at masculinity from a different perspective. It wasn't saying that men were toxic. So here's my take on this whole thing called toxic masculinity. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity. And here's why. If we look at masculinity, masculinity is really just an energy. So women have masculine traits. Masculine energy is the energy of doing. It's that ambitious, that drive. It's masculine. It's what gets us going, right? Femininity is the energy of being. Men have feminine energy. Now, when you say that, men go, "No, man, I ain't got no feminine energy." It's just an energy. It's the energy of feeling. It's the energy of being. We hear things like women's intuition, as though women have more intuition than men. No, men are just as intuitive as women. But we've been conditioned not to be in touch with that because we're taught not to be in touch with our feelings. And intuition is just an inner knowing. It's a feeling. And so when you hear this term toxic masculinity, there's no such thing. Now, when you see men doing bad things, that's a toxic behavior. That's not toxic masculinity. If it's a toxic behavior, it's a toxic behavior because the person that's perpetuating it is disconnected from his authentic masculinity. So
Say that again. Say it again. That was powerful.
So when you see a man that's acting out in what we call toxic masculinity, he's acting out that way is because he's disconnected from his authentic masculinity. When a man is connected to his authentic masculinity, he will never perpetuate toxic behaviors.
What is authentic masculinity? What does that look like, sound like?
Authentic masculinity comes from a man who is capable of being in touch with his authentic emotional self. So here's the thing. When we see violence, we look at violence and the first thing we think of is the energy and emotion of anger. The truth is, if we're willing to look a little deeper into what we see as anger, in a lot of cases, and I'd say the majority of cases, it's really not anger. It's really sadness or it's fear. But because men aren't taught and allowed to express those emotions, they're comfortable with anger because our culture says that's okay. Oh, he's just being a man. So authentic masculinity comes from a man who has done his emotional work. He's in touch with who he is as a human being. He recognizes and knows how to deal with his emotions appropriately. Therefore, if he feels anger, he can express anger. If he feels sadness, he can express sadness. So think of it this way. If you look at two kids playing out in the yard, kids are amazing because what they do is they express how they feel in the moment. So You can see two kids playing in the yard, and then they can be fighting, angry. 10 seconds later, they're kissing, hugging, making up because they release the anger. It's gone, it's done. And then they can connect back to who they really are, which is their hearts. Now, what we do, especially as men, is when we experience pain, we suppress, repress, and deny it. It stays trapped in our bodies energetically. That energy, if we don't let it go, it's in there. And there's scientific evidence that supports that when we hold on to repressed anger and negative emotion, it causes dis-ease, disease in our bodies. So being willing to let go of that negative energy, that negative emotion, is how we become free from it. But our culture, once again, has conditioned us, especially as men, to not express authentically the feelings that we have. And when we learn how to do that, we don't start building up all this negative energy. So let's look at violence as a whole. So we look at a guy that just walks into a place and starts killing folks, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that comes from years and years of repressed pain. And pain will cause a person to do irrational things. The energy, the emotion of pain in the body short circuits our thinking process, our rational thinking. So you're no longer thinking, you're just feeling this energy of anger inside, and you're trying to figure out a way to let it go. Unfortunately, some men turn to these drastic measures to try to heal, to let go of that anger. So authentic masculinity says, if something hurts, I need to be able to express it. If I'm sad, I need to be okay with saying I'm sad. If I'm afraid, I need to say I'm scared. Nothing wrong with that, because in doing so, you become authentic. Therefore, you're not expressing anger to hide behind underneath your fear or your sadness. And so the key to authentic masculinity is the process of understanding who you are as a human being. And it's about unpacking a lot of the negative emotional traumas that we're holding on to. So if you listen to the experts will tell you that every addictive behavior has at its core an unresolved emotional conflict. So something happens, we make a decision about it in our minds, we create a feeling in our bodies, and if it's negative, it drives negative behavior. So what we have to be willing to do is to identify that negative energy that's trapped in us. Now, when I use the term negative, it doesn't mean good or bad. See, what we're trying to do is process it as good or bad. It's not good or bad. It's just positive and negative. We live in a vibrational, energetic universe, and everything is just energy, right? So you got positive, you got negative. When we experience negative emotions, it's just negative energy in our bodies that we have to learn how to let go. And that's what the healing process does. It allows us to let go of negative energy. And that's how you get to authentic masculinity. You give men a space to share openly and honestly with themselves and with others.
I'm just taking a deep breath. We're releasing that. Hey, men in the audience, I'm glad y'all are here. I'm glad the women are here and we are in this conversation. And I feel like even the energy of this conversation is very good. It's very positive. And I feel like it's the energy of change. And this is what you seek to do. And as we talk about masculinity and authentic masculinity, I really like that. How does that help men to stay monogamous? I mean, you talked about connection and things like that, because I think one of the traits that go with that toxic masculinity, like we talked about, men cheat, they can't be monogamous. So when they're being authentic, and you're saying that as it relates to the pain and all of that, do you have anything additional? Or is it pretty much the same formula? Like, how do you apply that to remaining monogamous and nurturing in your relationship?
It's actually pretty simple. If you think in terms of energy, right? So I want you to think about this. So you meet someone for the first time, and you're happy. What's the energy? Think about the energy that you feel. It's like, oh yeah, I'm happy.
Mm-hmm.
So you start dating, and that energy, that happy energy is there. You're like, oh, you can't stop thinking about the person, and you just feel good inside. It's an energy. As time goes on, little things start to happen. Like, oh, she really pissed me off. And, he did something I didn't like. And so what happens is then we start getting this negative energy. And so think of it like a checking account. You have deposits and you have withdrawals. So you want to deposit more happiness. You deposit more happiness, you'll get more happiness out of it. So in relationships, what we do is we start off happy. Then we start taking withdrawals because negative things start happening. And then what happens, we start thinking negatively. And then we start doing negative things without even thinking about it, right? We start sabotaging our relationship because we want that happy feeling back. Okay? So what happens is we get into a relationship. It starts off happy. Then life happens. In an authentic relationship, life happens. Things are going to happen.
Yeah.
You're gonna have conflict. Within the conflict is that negative energy. And if you don't have the tools to get rid of that negative energy, it stays in you, right? So you've got this negative conflict energy built up, and all of a sudden you're going, I don't want to be with that person right now because I don't feel good. And then when we don't feel good, what do we want to do? We want to feel good, so what we do? Oh, maybe I can be happy over here. We've all heard the term, the grass is green on the other side, which is BS. But what happens is we meet someone else maybe, and we feel happy again. And then we say, well, with that other person, I didn't feel happy. So I'm going to go over here, and now I'm going to feel happy. Well, then this same cycle starts to happen. You're happy for a little while. Then all of a sudden conflict happens. I ain't happy no more. What am I going to do? I'm going to go look somewhere else to be happy. The key to the relationship is to be able to maintain that happiness. And the way to maintain that happiness is to be able to deal with conflict appropriately. Because if you're in relationship, you're always going to have conflict. Now, there's a distinction between conflict and fighting. They're not the same thing. I say that you don't ever have to fight in a relationship. And here's why. Fighting is about being right. So if you relinquish the need to be right and not have to have firm positions on certain things, you allow the relationship to flow. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to compromise on what you believe. It means that you're willing to say, I'd rather be happy than right. So in relationship, if I have that happy feeling, I'm with the right person. Now, when you're choosing the right person, obviously that's the key.
Yeah.
So choosing the right person means that you've taken the time to understand what your core values are in relationships. You're not buying into this over-romanticized movie type relationship where you think that everything's just, hunky-dory okay all the time. No, it's about knowing what you value, finding someone that shares those same values, and then making a commitment that we're going to be happy and not right. That's how you make relationships work. You want to be happy and not right. And so, again, we're constantly trying to do one thing. The one thing that we're always trying to do as human beings is to feel good.
Yeah.
That's what drives our behavior. We want to feel good. So think about it. We buy stuff, we do stuff, we do all these external things to feel good. But if we will focus on feeling good without the external stuff, then that's where self-love comes from. When I can love myself just the way that I am, I don't need anything outside of myself to be loved. Now, as a man, that's really hard to do. Because there's this conditioning that says, as men, as I mentioned, we're supposed to be the providers. And one of the things that I really struggled with when I first met my current wife was the fact that she made more money than I did.
Mm.
Now, why is that an issue? Because men are supposed to be the providers, right? And we feel
What did you
emasculated.
say? Three.
Procreate, provide, and protect. But see, as men, some of us, we feel emasculated when we aren't the breadwinners. Why? Because we think that that's what we're supposed to do. The good news is that that's changing. Why? Number one, it's because women said, no, we want equality. We want our own money. We don't need you. We can do it on our own. So the dynamics are changing for the better. It's great that women are out there in the workforce because a lot of people don't recognize, in this country for the first time, there are more women in the workforce than men. And did you also know that there are more women graduating from college than men these days?
Yes.
And so when you think about that, it's a change in roles. And so most people are uncomfortable with change. But change is like evolution. You can't stop it. The only thing constant is change. And so if you look at the roles of masculinity, they're changing rapidly, and men must be willing to embrace these new roles because I can assure you, we will become happier as a result of them when we learn to let go of some of these antiquated ideas about what it means to be a man.
So if you had to challenge a friend of yours and he was sitting in front of you and he was struggling with that one thing, with it could be the equality, the money, the roles, how things are going, what would you say? What is the man to man conversation? Because this is, like you said, you've broken it down to us, but how do you, man to man, what do you say?
This is a really difficult conversation for men to have, once again, because of the conditioning of our society. But what happens when you put a man in a safe space? And what is a safe space? A safe space is where a man feels comfortable speaking from his heart, speaking from that place of vulnerability and openness without fear of criticism or judgment. They just know that they're safe. And we as Black men have very few places that are like that. Now, I'm a huge proponent of men's groups. And men's groups, there are men's groups around the world where men come together to discuss these issues openly and honestly. So my conversation with that person that you just mentioned would be really simple. I'd ask two questions. Number one, are you genuinely happy with your life? Most men will say no. And I'll say, why? My relationship's not working. I don't have enough money. I hate my job. So we've got all these things. And my next question is, what are you willing to do to change it? If you're willing to change it, I have some tools that can support you in changing it. So what are we changing? In simple terms, we're changing mindsets. We're changing how we see the world, how we perceive the world, because it is my belief that what you think about, you bring about. And so if I can get men to shift what they're thinking about, how they're thinking, most cases it's pretty negative, especially as Black men, because we've got all this pressure, all these coming from all these different directions, and we're just trying to do our best to keep our heads up, right? But if I can get a man to change how he thinks, I can get a man to change how he acts. And so it's all about attitude. And your attitude is simply the compilation and expression of your thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. That's all an attitude is. It's a compilation and expression of your thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. So if I want to change my attitude, I've got to change those three things.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to be willing to change my perception of myself and the world around me. One of my favorite mentors is a guy named Wayne Dyer. And unfortunately, he passed away a while back. But he said something that really stuck with me. He says, if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at will change. And I really believe that. So as Black men, if we change how we see ourselves, because we know what the media generated narrative about us is. Once again, that's their business. What about our business? Change our inner dialogue about ourselves, how we see ourselves. And that's why I wrote this book. it gives men some tools to help them see how they see themselves.
What's the book before we get ready to get out here? You've given so many nuggets. Are these nuggets in the book?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us about the book and about your summit. Tell us about that and how they can get connected with you.
So everything I do is based around a simple movement. That movement is called Shatter the Stereotypes. So the book is called Shattering Black Male Stereotypes. How to eradicate the 10 most destructive media illusions about Black men. Now, the resource is shatteringBlackMaleStereotypes.com. So if you go to shatteringblackmalestereotypes.com, you'll have access to online courses. I've got an amazing podcast where I interview Black men who are doing remarkable things in the world. You have access to my blog and writings there, all at shatteringblackmalestereotypes.com. So it's a resource specifically for Black men who are courageous enough, and that's the key. The overwhelming majority of us aren't courageous enough to do this work. But for those of you who are ready, you go to shatteringblackmalestereotypes.com, and in July, I'm launching my annual Shatter the Stereotypes Empowerment Summit. And in this summit, I bring on brothers from all different walks of life. We talk about relationships, spirituality, health and fitness, fatherhood, and it's a group of men that come in, and it's all about empowerment. And we are empowering men around the globe.
Thank you for your courage to do the work for yourself and then to encourage other men to do their work. This conversation has been great. I agree with Robin Gibson. Great conversation. To the men in the audience who tuned in, thank you for supporting and showing up. And the Facebook user that he revealed himself, this was Coach Lee. Coach Lee and Ivan are in the Sports Talk with Friends. They support us, they sponsor our show, and we thank them for their support and for showing up and being a part of this conversation. And before we go, we tackled three. I'm a 3, 5, or 10 person, but I feel like we tackled three and we got into some important topics. Is there anything that we missed that you want to say to encourage a man who's he's ready? He needs to shift. Maybe he's not quite ready and he's still stuck in that cycle and the trauma is holding him down. What do we say? How do we get him to shift?
Well, one of the illusions is that Black men are all angry and violent. That's the stereotype, that as Black men, we're angry and violent. Why do you think that, a cop walks up to a Black guy and says he felt threatened? Why did he feel threatened? Because the media has perpetuated this idea that we're all angry and violent and ready to fight. So what I want to say to any man that's listening to this right now is, don't be afraid to connect to your emotions. Don't be afraid to do your inner work, to heal your heart so that you can connect to who you truly are. Because everything that you are is there, but you have it covered up with stuff. And so what you want to do is you want to uncover who you really are. And it's a process. See, we live in a society and culture that says, well, if I just do this, I have this instant gratification, I'll get fixed. No, this is a lifelong journey that we have to go on. The good news is there are resources to support you along this journey. And shatteringBlackMaleStereotypes.com is that resource that will provide any man who's ready, who's willing to do that inner work, to transform himself from the inside out, to become genuinely happy with his life.
Thank you for being a guest on Speak It, and that you did. And for those of you all who are tuning in, share this. Share this with a man in your life, a nephew, a brother, a father, a cousin. Share it on your social media. I think it's a conversation, and this is a resource that will benefit so many men. You can catch the replay on Facebook, Speak It with Shuli, or on our YouTube, Shuli Gibson. And you can find the podcast anywhere you listen to your podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And as we leave, I say Ashe.
Ashe. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.